Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. It's really good to see you all. And I think the first thing I need to say to you is Happy New Tax Year. The tax year starts today. My name is Peter Webb. I'm Head of Tax Advisory for the Fry Group. And today we're going to talk through tax changes for this new tax year. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we get too stuck into this. Firstly, please do use that Q&A button to ask questions as we go through. Type in your questions to the box, and what I will do is when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll leave some time, and I'll try my best to answer those questions for you. Second thing to say is a recording of the webinar is going to be available. We'll be happy to send the slides through to you as well, and our contact details are going to be shown at the end. So let's get started. So our agenda for today. So we're going to look through the backdrop for this latest, I'm going to call it mini budget that we had on March the 23rd. So we'll look through specific changes that were announced, but also we'll have a look at what we already knew was going to change from today. And then we'll have an interesting look at what could change in the future and what you can do to protect yourself from increasing taxes. And finally, we're going to have that time where you can ask me some questions, and I'll do my best to answer those for you. So you can ask me some questions, and actually I can ask you some questions as well. So the first question I have for you is going to pop up on your screen quite shortly. So on the 1st of April 2023, we're going to see corporation tax rise to its highest level since, and you've got three choices. ABBA won Eurovision with Waterloo in 1974, Bucks Fizz won Eurovision with Making Your Mind Up in 1981, and Katrina and the Waves won Eurovision with Love Shine a Light in 1997. So 1974, 1981, 1997. So which of those dates are the last time we saw corporation tax at 25%, so or above? So I'll give you a chance to answer that. So make your selection. Okay, I can see lots and lots of you are voting. I think the voting's beginning to slow down a little bit. Just a couple more seconds on that one. Okay, I think we'll close the polling there and see how you did. Let's see what answer you get. 63% of you, that's way better than the first session. 63% of you got this right. So corporation tax rise on the 1st of April 2023. It's the highest corporation tax rate we've seen in almost 50 years, going back to ABBA winning Eurovision in 1974. Okay. There we are. So why don't we think about the backdrop for this latest mini budget statement on March the 23rd. So go back a little bit further than that. The previous autumn budget statement was delivered by Rishi Sunak on 27th of October 2021. Now, that was actually National Black Cat Day. That's completely true, it's a thing. But it was also more seriously about a month before the Omicron wave struck and about 4 months before Russia invaded Ukraine. So a lot has changed, and the backdrop to the latest mini budget statement is far different to the backdrop that we had for the last autumn budget statement. So we have inflation, which is higher than it's been in quite a while, and the associated cost of living crisis. And these form the broad canvas when we look at the situation for this budget statement. Inflation is now set to hit maybe 8% this month. And in not unrelated news, global energy prices are soaring. The upside for Rishi Sunak, but maybe not for me and you, is that we're all going to be paying a lot more taxes because of inflation. And the downside for the Chancellor is that the cost of borrowing all of that money to pay for COVID is going to be higher. So on Friday, 1st of April, we saw UK household energy bills potentially rise by about 54%. That's extraordinary. Since the pandemic began, the government has spent around £410 million paying for COVID. And that's around £6,100 for each of us. Paying the interest on that debt is set to be an increasing cost. So Thursday, 2nd of May, 2024. What happens on Thursday, the 2nd of May, 2024, you may ask? Well, that's actually when the next general election is set to be held. And did Rishi Sunak have half an eye on that election when he made his budget statement? I think we're going to see that actually he certainly did have an eye on that. So what did Rishi Sunak announce on the 23rd of March? So in terms of the new announcements he actually made, well, actually the spring budget statement is not supposed to be an announcement for tax and policy changes. That is genuinely supposed to be reserved for the autumn budget statement, but the backdrop is fast changing and he did have some interesting changes for us. So I think the first thing to say is that we're going to see from the pre-announced changes, what we already knew was going to happen before March 23rd, that national insurance contributions are going to rise from today. Now, what Rishi Sunak did was to increase the level at which you start paying national insurance contributions as an employee. So what we're going to see is, at the moment, it's £9,880 of earnings, and then you start to pay national insurance contributions. So from July 2022, so July this year, that's going to increase to £12,570. In real terms, we knew there was going to be an increase in national insurance contributions for employees. This relieves that increase by about £270, and that's really welcome. There was quite a big call for the rise in national insurance contributions just to be scrapped because of the cost of living crisis, if I can say that. But he didn't go that far. There is a little bit of relief there for us. There's a reduction in fuel duty. So fuel duty was reduced by 5p a litre for 12 months. And that reduction came in on, 6 p.m. on March 23rd. When we think about fuel duty, each household in the UK pays around about £1,000 a year in fuel duty. And fuel duty represents about 3.5% of the government's tax receipts. So it's not an insignificant number. There are commentators out there who are questioning the wisdom of reducing fuel duty. Are we taking away an incentive for people to consider travelling in a more sustainable way, perhaps? And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens to fuel duty in 12 months' time. Will that 5%, 5p, not 5%, that 5p reduction, will that genuinely be cancelled in a year's time? And finally, on this slide, I'm always expecting Rishi Sunak to pull a rabbit out of a hat. And this time it was a Flemish giant. So the largest rabbits in the world are Flemish giants. This was a really big rabbit out of a hat. Not many of us were predicting or expecting the Chancellor to announce a 1p in the pound reduction in income tax. That was a real surprise. And that 1p in the pound reduction is going to apply from 6th of April 2024. So 6th of April 2024, income tax reduces by 1%. On Thursday, the 2nd of May 2024, just a few weeks later, we're scheduled to have our next general election. Now, it doesn't take much, even a bear with very little brain like myself can connect the dots on those two events. And I wonder how many times we're going to see the reduction in the rate of income tax be headlined as really good news between now and 6th of April 2024. I think what it does do is allow Rishi Sunak to retain his credentials as a genuine traditional Tory tax-cutting Chancellor. So as well as some personal tax announcements, on March 23rd, there were some business tax announcements as well. So we will run through these. Perhaps they're not quite so interesting for us as people, but businesses, these were really important. So eligibility for VAT relief on energy-saving materials. Now that's going to be expanded, and the VAT rate is going to be reduced to 0 for 5 years from last Friday. That's really welcome. Research and development. Research and development has a really broad definition. So R&D. R&D is the process of taking an idea, transforming it into a fully fledged product or process, researching, designing, creating, testing. They're all parts of R&D. So the announcement is that from April 2023, all data, cloud computing, and pure maths costs associated with R&D will qualify for R&D relief. And for businesses, this is a really welcome relief. In some circumstances, businesses are able to deduct 230% of eligible R&D costs against their taxable income. It's a really valuable relief, and extensions to this tax break are very welcome indeed, especially against the backdrop of increasing corporation taxes. Now, last time Rishi Sunak stood up to deliver a budget statement, that was October 2021, he introduced a very specific and targeted business rate exemption, and that was due to apply from 1st of April 2023 until 31st of March 2035. And it was a very green relief. It was for eligible plant and machinery used in on-site renewable energy generation and storage, and for low carbon heat networks. So it was due to come in April 2023. That's been brought forward from April 2022. In summary, when we look at business taxes announcements on March 2022, then what we're seeing are green reliefs and extensions to R&D reliefs. And these are really, really welcome announcements. So as well as the announcements that we've seen for personal tax and business tax on 23rd of March 2022, there'd already been a series of announcements from what was going to change on 6th of April 2022, things we already knew were going to change. Well, actually, the first one is something that's not going to change, and that is allowances are going to be frozen. So from 6th of April 2022, your allowances continue to remain frozen. When we think about income tax, you have a personal allowance, £12,570 of income that you can earn free of income tax, and that stays the same. The basic rate, the 20% tax band, that remains frozen at £37,700 of income taxed at 20%. Different rules for Scotland, which we'll mention in a second. So your 40% tax rate starts at £50,270, and that remains the same. Those frozen allowances, they're set to be frozen until April 2026. And in fact, that represents a real term tax increase. And given, I've mentioned it a couple of times already, inflation at 8%, hitting 8% this month, that genuinely means you're going to pay more tax. What else did we know was already going to happen? Dividend tax rates are going to be increased by 1.25% from today. And that takes them from the lowest rate of 8.75% up to 39.35%. And remember that the dividend allowance, £2,000, that remains frozen. And from today, we mentioned it previously, those national insurance contributions are going to increase by 1.25%. And the additional has been earmarked for spending on the NHS, health and social care in the UK. So that 1.25% increase, it applies to employees, so a 1.25% increase for employees. The self-employed who pay class 4 national insurance contributions, again, that's a 1.25% increase on those. And in addition, employers, they also pay national insurance on the salary that's paid to their employees, and they will pay an extra 1.25% on their national insurance contributions as well. I mentioned Scotland. So in Scotland, a separate rate of tax and different tax bands will continue to apply for basically your earnings, your non-savings, non-dividend income. Now, if you're in Scotland, you have the same tax-free personal allowance, £12,570, but you have different tax bands. So you start at 19%, you go all the way up to 46%. And the rate at which you start paying the higher rate of 41%, that's actually £43,662. So the rates in Scotland are different. So what does that mean? Try and give you a real example here. If you earned £50,000 and that's your taxable income, if you're a resident in Scotland, you would actually pay £1,489 extra in tax than if you actually lived south of the border and had the same income. I'm going to mention pensions. So when we think about frozen allowances, pensions, you have a lifetime allowance for the amount of tax advantaged pension savings that you can have. That remains frozen at just over £1 million and £73,100, if I've got that right. But that remains frozen until 2026. You have an annual allowance for pension savings. That's an absolute maximum of £40,000. But again, it stayed the same. It remains frozen. So just a quick mention on VAT. So I don't know if you remember this, but in July 2020, hotels, holiday accommodation, kind of tourist attractions, they were really suffering with COVID. These are some of the hardest hit industry sectors who suffered because of COVID. And to give some relief for that, the rate of VAT on their supplies was reduced to 5% from 20%. Last year, that went back up to 12.5%. And from last Friday, that went back up to the full rate of 20%. So now when you look at hotels, hospitality, holiday accommodation, attractions, they're now back at paying the full rate of VAT. Inheritance tax. Now, this is an interesting one. So the inheritance tax nil rate band remains frozen at £325,000. So the amount of inheritance tax, what that nil rate band means is that's the amount of your estate which is not going to be charged to 40% inheritance tax when you pass it on. Now, ordinarily, spouses can pass on assets between them. There's no inheritance tax paid usually. And then when perhaps that second spouse passes, that's when the inheritance tax hits. And usually there's two nil rate bands, £650,000. I'm going into this a little bit because that rate, that nil rate band rate, has remained the same since 2009. Okay, so what I'm going to do is ask you a question, and this is a question that's going to pop up on your screen now. So that nil rate band has been frozen since 2009 at £325,000. So if that nil rate band had increased with inflation, how much would that now be worth? And you've got three choices: £393,000, £424,000, or £464,000. So I'll just give you a chance to answer that. So I can see some of you are voting already. Okay, I think the voting's slowing down a little. Perhaps I could just give you a few more seconds on that one, and then we'll close the polling and see how you did. It's multiple choice, so the right answer's there somewhere. Okay, so let's see. Oh, 47% of you have actually got this right. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? So £325,000 in 2009 would have meant £464,750,000 now. So we'll close that one down. And what this actually means, in real terms, what this means for a couple, if that nil rate band had stayed in step with inflation, you would actually be paying £112,000 less in inheritance tax today. And I've used that to illustrate the genuine effect of freezing allowances. They do mean that you will pay more tax because of inflation. Okay. So why don't we move on a little bit and think about what could change in the future? So Rishi Sunak announced consultations on a few different things. So tax incentives for business investment. So that rate of corporation tax rises it to 25% in April 2023. It's 19% at the moment, so that's a significant increase. And also in April 2023, what we call the super deduction for investing in plant and machinery will end. What's that super deduction? Give you an example. You buy a bulldozer for your business and you pay £100,000 for it. You'll be able to reduce your taxable profits by £130,000, provided the right conditions have been met. That's what we call the super deduction. That ceases in April 2023. So over the course of the next few months, there's going to be a consultation on how that can be replaced. So Rishi Sunak is also concerned that the current tax structure for businesses is not incentivizing businesses to invest in people. So it's going to be quite interesting what the suggestions are for that. We've seen some really generous tax allowances for research and development. I think we're going to see even more generous allowances for research and development. That's what's been promised. So I think watch out for announcement on all of these in the next few months. So over the last few years, we've seen consultations that have already taken place with recommendations for reforming both inheritance tax and capital gains tax. So I'm just pausing to read something to you. So this is what Bill Dodwell, he's the tax director at the Office of Tax Simplification. This is what he said. If the government considers the simplification priority is to reduce distortions in behaviour, and this is the important bit, it should consider either more closely aligning capital gains tax rates with income tax rates or addressing boundary issues as between capital gains tax and income tax. So at the moment, those capital gains tax rates currently sit at historic lows of between 10% and 20% for disposals other than property. In England, income tax rates are generally 20%, 40% and 45%. So could we see capital gains tax rates increase to those higher income tax rates? For inheritance tax, the Office of Tax Simplification suggested, amongst much else actually, abolishing a really valuable business relief for business assets that are passed on. They also suggested abolishing the uplift to market value at the date of death for assets in a death estate, which is a really valuable capital gains tax relief. Now we get to the, I'm not sure if I can say this in one breath, the all-party parliamentary group on inheritance and intergenerational fairness. Just slips off the tongue. Some of the key reforms proposed by them were, this is quite an interesting one, a flat rate of 10% of inheritance tax charged on death and lifetime transfers. They also wanted to abolish all tax allowances except for spouses and charities. That would be extraordinary. And they too wanted to abolish the capital gains tax uplift on that death estate. Now, to be fair, on the 1st of December 2021, the government said it would not be pressing ahead with any of these recommendations for reforming capital gains tax and inheritance tax at the moment. But I think what's interesting is some of those suggestions over the last few years, I think give quite a real indication of the possible direction of travel that we might see in the future for capital gains tax and inheritance tax. Interesting comments here. So what would a Labour government do? They have some really interesting comments. So what we see from Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor, people who get their income through wealth should pay more. Keir Starmer, nothing is left off the table. Rachel Reeves again, stocks, shares and buy-to-let properties are stated targets for Rachel Reeves. Also, non-UK domiciles, private equity managers, venture capital trusts, public schools, not quite sure, they're also targets. Really interesting on that final bullet point on the slide. Every single tax relief will be reviewed. So going back to 2019 and John McDonnell, this is what he said. A Labour government would abolish non-domiciled status in its first budget. Apologies, I get quite excited by that. As part of a comprehensive plan to increase tax transparency and clamp down on tax avoidance and evasion. That would be extraordinary if it actually happened. A non-UK domicile status, well, what that allows a non-UK domicile to do is to exclude their overseas assets from a 40% UK inheritance tax charge. That's incredibly valuable. And also when a non-UK domicile is resident in the UK, they have the opportunity for a time at least, and provided various complicated conditions are met, they can exclude what we call unremitted overseas income and unremitted overseas gains from being taxed in the UK. And that's a massive advantage over a UK domicile. If you're a UK resident, UK domiciled, you're simply taxed on your worldwide income and gains as they arise. It's hard to know what the world's going to look like in May 2024, but if Rishi Sunak's income tax rate cut doesn't sway the voters, I think we could be in for some really momentous tax changes with a change of government. So going back to paying for COVID, what else could happen? As we know, the bill for COVID is massive. And I've said the number a couple of times now, £410 billion. So how is the government going to pay for that? So governments raise money by taxing and borrowing. I can just pause there and think about borrowing. In 2015, the then Chancellor George Osborne implemented the repayment of a significant portion of the debt the government in previous years had incurred to pay for World War I, 100 years earlier. And incredibly, and I find this quite extraordinary, some of the debt paid off in 2015 was money the government borrowed in 1720 when the South Sea bubble burst and the government needed funds. The reason for using those two examples is that sometimes governments do seem content to live with debt for the very long term. One suggestion for reforming pensions is a way that's been suggested for actually repaying COVID. So pension tax relief could be changed. So how does pension tax relief work? Well, at the moment, you claim pension tax relief at the rate you pay income tax. So if you're a 20% taxpayer, you get 20% tax relief on contributions to your pension scheme. A higher or additional rate taxpayer can claim 40 or 45% respectively. So the suggestion is to pay for COVID, that tax relief is a flat 25% on pension contributions. So what does that mean to the different levels of UK taxpayer? So for basic rate taxpayers, those paying 20%, it's a benefit. 25% is a little bit extra. But if you're paying tax at 40 or 45%, this is genuinely going to hit you in the pocket. You will receive less of a deduction. Finally, final box on this slide is quite an interesting one, isn't it? The wealth taxes. So on 25th of October 2021, a group of 30 of the wealthiest people in the UK sent an open letter to Rishi Sunak calling on him to introduce a wealth tax. And they wanted that wealth tax on the richest people. And the reason, they didn't want the cost of COVID recovery to fall on the younger generation or on those with lower income. Now, Rishi Sunak has gone into print to say he doesn't think a wealth tax is actually appropriate, but it's quite interesting that there is a call out there for a wealth tax. Excuse me. Okay, so we've talked about the increasing tax burden. So we're going to think about what you can do to protect yourself from increasing taxes. So the increasing tax burden, by 2026, the amount of your income you will pay in taxes is actually going to reach its highest level since Clement Attlee's Labour government in the early 1950s. And that reached an extraordinary level because the economy was absolutely reeling from the costs of the Second World War. So we're going to go back to those kinds of levels of tax that we're going to pay. And that is on the basis of the changes that have already been implemented and announced, without factoring in any other changes that could be made. So can you protect yourself from increasing taxes? I have a few suggestions here. There are many others. So I think first thing I would say, diversify your investments against different tax rules. I think that's always great advice. You're reducing the risk of legislative change that change may have on your investments. Perhaps an example, if you only invest in UK buy-to-let properties, what would a rule change around buy-to-let properties do for you? That could have disastrous consequences for you if all of your eggs are in that one basket. Another thing to say is that it's very rare that rule changes are retrospective. So take advantage of the tax reliefs and allowances that are available now while they're still actually there. Another comment. Are all your family members using all their available tax allowances? And again, I think this is always great advice. Each year, you each have available tax allowances for income tax, inheritance tax, capital gains tax, dividend income, interest income, and you have an allowance for ISAs, individual savings accounts, if you're actually a UK tax resident. And ISAs are great. You're able to invest for adults £20,000 a year into an ISA, and your investments are then free of income tax or capital gains tax. And if you don't use these allowances every year, you actually lose them. And I think a final point on this slide is around capital gains tax. I think it's worth considering, is now the time to take gains out of your investments. Rates of capital gains tax on investments are at 10% and 20%. They are historically low numbers. Could those rates rise in the future? It's very hard to gaze into that crystal ball and say for sure that they're going to rise. But I think it's possible, in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, I think capital gains tax is actually very low hanging fruit when it comes to increasing taxes. Okay, So if you're struggling, you've almost made it. Thank you for bearing with me this far. So we're moving on to our key takeaways, and then we'll move on to some of those great questions I'm sure you're asking me. So key takeaways. The amount of tax we pay is increasing, and because of all of those frozen allowances and some changes that have been announced, it's going to increase further. You need to consider strategies to protect yourself from rising taxes. And I think the final thing I would say to you, if you know that tax changes are going to happen, you may be able to take action to protect yourself. So do stay up to date with tax changes. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is have a look at some of those great questions you've been asking me. So if you do want to still ask a question, you can open up the Q&A box and pop in your question now. That you still have time to do that. But let's have a look and see what we have. Okay. Oh, great question first off the bat. Does the government have plans to introduce a wealth tax based on worldwide wealth? If so, would this be a standalone one-off charge, or would it be an annual charge? Would this be an additional tax, or would it be offsettable against any other taxes? A lot of questions in there and an awful lot of uncertainty as well. So no, Rishi Sunak has said he doesn't feel that this government will actually introduce a wealth tax. There has been a call for it, and it's not impossible that we could have a different government in a couple of years' time. So if a wealth tax is introduced, there's going to be a lot of legislation, a lot of detail around that, and we'll see what that looks like. At the moment, we just don't know what that would look like. The various wealth taxes we have in those European jurisdictions and Argentina, that they play around all of those different things. So I don't know, that's the honest answer, but watch this space and we'll see what happens. Okay. What is the likelihood that UK state pensions will be increased for overseas Britons? Oh, that's a really tough one, isn't it? Because if you're living in a jurisdiction which doesn't have the right agreement with the UK government, then you don't get an annual rise in your state pension. And that's really reducing your income in real terms over years. I've seen nothing on this to suggest that it's going to be increased for overseas Britons. Yeah, it's a very good call indeed, but I'm not seeing anything hopeful there for you, I'm sorry to say. Okay, so does the government have plans to introduce a scheme whereby they will charge a capital gain on the notional value of the increase in asset value prior to the actual selling of such assets? No, this is very, very similar to the idea of a wealth tax. And we're not seeing any suggestion that Rishi Sunak in particular wants to do that. I don't think that's impossible in future years. Unlikely, but not impossible. And as I said, there is the call for that. So at the moment, you pay capital gains tax when you crystallize the gain in most cases, one or two very minor and extraordinary exceptions to that. But no, you generally pay capital gains tax where you dispose of something either by selling it or gifting it. Not really seeing that change just at the moment. So if the national insurance limit increases to 12,570 in July 22, presume a self-employed's profits will have to be time prorated to calculate the class 4 national insurance for 22-23. Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting computation to do. So yeah, actually timing that for partway through the tax year is going to keep all of us accountants really busy with our calculators and abacuses, but it's not the cleverest thing to do, I don't think. But yes, there will be a pro rata on that. Can you please confirm that pension contributions in 22-23 are still relievable at marginal income tax rate? Absolutely, yes, I can confirm that. There have been no changes to that just at the moment. There has been the suggestion that that could change in the future. We go to a flat 25% rate. I think there have been a large number of changes around the taxation of pensions. So I would expect that's something that the government will continue to tweak. I think freezing the allowances is actually a very stealthy way to raise the tax on or decrease the amount of relief you get for your pension contributions. And bear in mind that if you're a very high earner, that £40,000 annual allowance for tax advantage pension savings is tapered away. And this is a great question. Are ISAs also free from death duty taxes? Absolutely not. They're protected from income tax, they're protected from capital gains tax, but they are in the realm of that 40% inheritance tax charge. So that is something that you do want to think about. I think you often think about income tax and capital gains tax because you see that on a year-to-year basis, but that exposure to UK inheritance tax, sometimes you're not aware of it. So when you think about inheritance tax, do make a plan for that. And the starting point is to understand what is your exposure, what assets are within the scope of inheritance tax, what assets are protected from inheritance tax, what is your exposure? And that's the starting point for making a plan to reduce the amount of inheritance tax that will be paid. Okay, another great question. Would the tax allowance apply to non-UK tax resident? I'm going to give you a very typical tax advisor answer here. It depends. So if you're a UK citizen, if you're a citizen of the EU, generally you will be entitled to what we call a personal allowance for income tax. Capital gains tax exemptions, they do apply for non-residents. So generally, yes, but do watch that income tax allowance, particularly